Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I thought what I'd do is just have a bit of a discussion about Phantasy Star Universe. The reason for that is because with me doing the recent 2025 in Phantasy Star video, I kind of wanted to reflect on some of the other games as well, even the ones that aren't having the anniversaries. And I feel that Phantasy Star Universe is a game that the perception of it has changed quite significantly since it launched originally. And what I wanted to do is just do a bit of a discussion really, talk about what the game was perceived like when it launched. I want to talk about some of the reasons why people are still playing PSU now, and also some of the connections that you can see between this game, and it's quite interesting looking at Phantasy Star Universe and seeing how it affected future games. So with that, first of all, let's cover the actual release and the original reception of PSU when it released. So, the base game of Phantasy Star Universe, that launched in 2006. It was a bit of a staggered release, so it released at the end of August 2006 in Japan. It was October in America and then November in Europe and Australia. For some reason, SEGA did this thing at the time where they used to stagger the releases quite significantly. That was on the PS2 and Windows versions because PSU was actually available on multiple platforms, so there were servers that were PS2 and PC, which shared the same servers, and there was a separate Xbox 360 server. The Xbox 360 server, that went live in America first, and that went live in October 2006. It went live in Europe and Australia in November, and then didn't go live in Japan until December. The reason for that is probably just because the Xbox 360 was never really a very popular console in Japan, so it was kind of an afterthought, where in the West it was much more of a popular console. But pretty much 2006, regardless of where you decided to play it. So obviously, Phantasy Star Universe had a very, very difficult job when it released because it was the next Phantasy Star game after PSO Blue Burst. And PSO Blue Burst was kind of seen as the, I guess some people would say it was seen as like the pinnacle of PSO. It was everything you wanted from PSO, extra episodes, extra enemies, loads of rare gear. My personal preference is the GameCube version because I actually don't like some of the changes they made in Blue Burst personally, but SEGA kind of pushed it as like the ultimate version of PSO. So for PSU to follow that up, it had a very, very difficult task. Bearing in mind that PSO had several years of support and people have been playing it since the Dreamcast. When PSU was announced, it was obviously quite a big shift from PSO in terms of visually, because obviously the times have moved on quite significantly. So graphically, PSU was quite a big upgrade from PSO. But the actual sort of art style and everything of PSU was completely different. It was in a new setting, so it wasn't even linked to PSO. And when the game finally released in 2006, the reception of it by a lot of the fans was honestly pretty negative. I remember on a lot of the main forums for Phantasy Star, particularly sites like PSO World, there was a lot of negativity around PSU when it released, because a lot of PSO fans, to be blunt, kind of just wanted another PSO game. The same kind of criticism was levelled at the Episode 3 Card Revolution game as well, because it didn't play like a typical PSO game. It kind of felt that if a game wasn't going to be like PSO, and by like PSO I mean almost identical to PSO, then people didn't really want it. And PSU definitely suffered from that when it released. SEGA may have saw that coming because when PSU actually launched, the Blue Burst servers didn't go down at the same time. So there was a period in time in the Japanese servers and on the Western side as well, where Phantasy Star Online Blue Burst and PSU were actually both active at the same time. So you could literally log on to PSU, play for a bit, log off, and then log on to PSO. I think that probably wasn't a great idea in retrospect because all you were doing was splitting the player base between the two games. But it's almost like SEGA knew that they were going to have a hard sell with PSU when it released. And unfortunately, the review side from journalists wasn't much more positive either. So I've actually got a few review scores here from when PSU actually released. So if we just take a few magazines of the time, again, I know some of these are not reliable at all, but it was averaging sort of 5.5 to 6.5 out of 10 depending on the version. Other sites were giving it sort of in the region of about 5 to 6 out of 10. It wasn't written off as a terrible game, but it really wasn't lauded over at all. It was seen as a bit of a disappointment when it released. So, unfortunately, PSU really did not have a smooth launch at all. And it was like an uphill battle really for the game, because as soon as it released, not only did you have these negative reviews in the press, but you also had the players not really wanting to play either. And it put SEGA in a really awkward place with the game. Now, looking back at it now, it's actually really interesting, because I think over time, the perception of PSU has improved quite significantly. I think at the time, back in 2006, it was kind of an echo chamber where the only thing you could compare it to at the time really was PSO. And people absolutely adored PSO and didn't want anything different, so anything different to PSO was just seen as not as good. By which I mean by the Phantasy Star fan base in particular. I think as time has gone on, I think time has been quite kind to PSU, honestly. And that is reflected by the fact that here I am in 2025, still being able to play it on a private server. Now, admittedly, PSU is nowhere near as popular as PSO. PSO has several private servers, some of which have hundreds and hundreds of people. Where for PSU, as far as I'm aware, there is only one private server currently active, which is this one, which is Clementine. But there is clearly still a demand for it. So if I look at the current server at the moment, you can actually see just here, there are currently, and this is being recorded like early evening in the UK, and there's 84 people online, which isn't really too bad for a game that no one apparently liked when it released. So the perception of the game, I do feel, has changed quite a bit. Now, reasons for that, I think just over time you learn to forgive games that were maybe seen as flawed at the time. I mean, again, PSO Episode 3 Card Revolution is another example of that. A lot of people hated that game when it released, but I think that now, if you look at it as a separate thing, it holds up perfectly well. So, next thing we need to look at is why I think PSU is still worth checking out now. If you're new to the Phantasy Star franchise and you're maybe checking out some of the games, maybe you've played a bit of PSO too, sometimes people might be interested to see where some of the decisions came from, and PSU, really for the time, brought quite a few new things to the franchise that have kind of stuck with Phantasy Star since. So one of the main first things that it introduced is PSU, I believe, was the first Phantasy Star game to use photon arts. And if you play PSO2 or NGS, you'll know that photon arts are basically a core part of the game now, and have been for the past several games. And PSU was kind of the start of that. Now, yes, it was quite basic, but this is where it started. And it's really interesting looking at PSU because you can kind of see some of the seeds for PSO2 being sowed. So there was definitely a few new ideas with PSU. So obviously we had the same kind of system as PSO where we had these timed attacks. Again, you can button mash in PSU, whereas you can't in PSO. But PSU still incentivized using time attacks because it introduced what was called just attack, which is where if you time your attacks correctly, you get more damage out of them. And that also applied to the photon arts as well. So photon arts were a new thing introduced in PSU, which were skills tied to your weapons, and it's something that's remained with the franchise since. So although it was kind of fun to bash PSU at the time, and a lot of people did, believe me, I think looking back on it now, you can see it has had quite a big impact on games like PSO2. Yeah, so it's really interesting looking at PSU and the photon arts that it introduced, because they've obviously been used extensively in the game since. There's been a little bit of a variation on how you use them, but the sort of core ideas remain the same. So I think PSU should be applauded for that, in that it did have an actual impact on the series. At the time, obviously, there was a lot of negativity about the game, but if you look back at it now, it's really interesting just to see where some of these ideas that were used in later games came from. Another thing that PSU introduced, which I will show in a minute, is PSU, I believe, was also the first game to use first-person shooting. Now, again, it is very, very janky. You can't move your character while you're in first person. It completely locks you still. and the sight is very slow and kind of unwieldy to use, but it does allow you to do first-person shooting. Again, first-person was a thing that started to become more common in the series, but it's not necessarily used in NGS, but in games like NGS, you've still got that kind of over-the-shoulder view where you zoom in and can aim more carefully. So it's more or less the same thing, just not a true first-person view, I guess. So I think it is really, really fascinating to see where some of the ideas for the later games came from. And when you look at it, you can see that there is a few things that PSU brought in that sort of stuck around. Another example of this is racial abilities. So again, this is something that SEGA kind of dabbled with in different games. PSU basically introduced the concept of different races having special abilities that they could use. So that is things like casts having the SUV weapons, beasts have nanoblasts, and then in later games, like I believe it was in either PSP2 or PSP2 Infinity, they introduced ones for the humans and humans as well, which were called Mirage Blasts. And then later on, I think Infinity introduced one for humans as well, which was called an Infinity Blast. But again, PSU was the start of that. So I honestly think that for the time, I'm not going to say it was a revolutionary game by any means, because it wasn't. I think it was never going to have the same kind of impact as PSO did. You know, PSO was literally the very first online multiplayer RPG on a console. You know, PSU was never going to live up to that same kind of acclaim, and to expect that would be ridiculous. But I do still think it deserves to be held in decent regard for some of the ideas that it had. Yeah, so if we go back to just the racial abilities briefly, I can actually show that now because I've actually got one ready. So yeah, PSU was the first one to introduce things like this, the Nanoblast. Now, unfortunately, Nanoblast would never really make an appearance again outside of the Goral games, and that is because the beast race that they were tied to never made it outside of the Goral system games, unfortunately. But it's still a really cool addition. I kind of see the racial abilities as, I guess, PSU's spin on photon blasts, because to my knowledge, I don't think you has any kind of photon blasts in PSU. So I see this is kind of the equivalent of that. So yes, you could say that PSO had the idea first was photon blasts, but it was interesting to see them try something new. So it's really, really interesting because with a game like PSO, where it's always been kind of held in high regard, it's expected that as time goes on, people will have a great fondness for it and people will continue to want to play it. And that is obviously the case with the amount of private servers that there are. But when you come to a game like PSU, where it had a very rough launch and wasn't very well received, it's really, really interesting to see how the perception of it changes over time. And it makes me wonder if other games will be thought of the same. So the negativity when a Phantasy Star game launches is nothing new by any means. I mean, even when Blue Burst launched, there were issues with that when that launched. People weren't happy that it didn't launch with Ultimate difficulty. So for anyone who wasn't there at the time, when PSO Blue Burst launched, we only had access to normal, hard and very hard. They added Ultimate quite a lot later on, for reasons I have no idea. And people were mad about that. People were also mad about the fact that with Blue Burst, obviously it was PC only, and it was server-side characters, so you couldn't play it offline anymore. So people weren't happy about that either. So there's always been people who have been very vocal about issues with Phantasy Star games. That is definitely nothing new. But I do feel that PSU is probably the most pronounced that it's ever been. Maybe outside of now with NGS, because I feel that NGS is kind of in a similar position that PSU was when it launched. There is obviously a lot of negativity about NGS as well. And I do kind of wonder if in a couple of years people will look back on NGS a bit differently. I think for me on that front, it kind of depends what SEGA decide to do with the game. It is a bit different for a live service game as well, just because you don't know how they're going to change the game over time. Obviously, with games like PSO and PSU, what you got when it released was what you had, basically. Now, PSU did later on go on to get an expansion, which launched in, I believe it was about 2007, which was called Ambition of the Illuminous. That did make quite a lot of changes and some improvements. And I think generally the expansion, once PSU launched with that, once the Ambition of the Illuminous had actually launched, I feel that the perception of the game did improve a little bit. It still wasn't loved, I wouldn't say, but I would say that people seem to enjoy it a little bit more. So yeah, it has been really, really interesting just looking back at the game and just seeing how it was thought of at the time and how things have changed since. And don't get me wrong, I know that the negativity around games is certainly not confined to Phantasy Star. I know it's in basically any franchise you can think of. But what I want to do is basically look back at a previous example of a game that wasn't well thought of at the time. And just, it was more of a curiosity than anything, just to see how things have changed since. I think the fact that PSU now has a private server, which currently has about 80 people playing, shows that there is at least some love for the game. And would I recommend trying it out? I think if you like Phantasy Star and you like the online games, I think PSU can be really interesting to see that sort of... It's almost like the redheaded stepchild and the missing link between PSO and PSO2. And that it is quite old-fashioned, it is still quite janky. There are still some aspects that keep very close to PSO. Such as there is still quite a big focus on finding res later on. But there are definitely areas where it does feel much more akin to a game like PSO2. So it's a very, very interesting entry in the series, and definitely one where SEGA were kind of experimenting with the formula and trying to see what would work and what wouldn't. So that's going to be more or less it for this video, I think. I know it's just been kind of me going on about PSU, but I wanted to kind of just give my impression of the difference really between how PSU was perceived when it first launched and how it's perceived now. As I say, I think if you are a fan of Phantasy Star and you've never played PSU before, I would definitely give it a shot. The Clementine server is obviously a private server, it is totally free. It's very, very easy to set up as well. It is worth trying. There is also going to be what they're calling a new player experience, which is meant to launch at some point. It has been delayed a little bit, so I don't know when that's going to be exactly from this video. But they are trying to make the game a little bit more accessible for new players as well, because it was quite endgame focused. So hopefully that'll make it a bit more accessible for newer players who want to try it for the first time. But I think it is a really, really interesting game just to see the decisions that SEGA made with the franchise, what worked, what didn't, and ultimately what made it into the next game with PSO2. So yeah, I hope you found that relatively interesting. If you've got any questions or anything, or if you want to share your experiences about PSU, please leave them in the comments below. I personally played on the PC servers pretty much from launch, and I remember having a good time with it for the most part. I certainly never enjoyed PSU as much as PSO, but I still had a good time with it. I still think it is a game that does deserve to be remembered. So yeah, if you have any good experiences of PSU, feel free to leave them below. Let me know what you think as well about the perception of PSU, if you were there at the time. Do you remember all the negativity as well? And what do you think about PSU as a product now? Do you think it actually holds up now? Yeah, we'll end that video there. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, a subscribe. You can join as a member on YouTube if you want to. You can also follow or sub over on Twitch at Section Skyline. And in addition to that, we do have a Discord you can join as well, which I'll leave a link to in the description. On the Discord as well, we do a weekly event on the weekends where we just have a voice chat catch up on there, so feel free to drop by for that as well. Yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.